My mother-in-law smirked as I walked into family court holding my 7-year-old daughter's hand. "You don't stand a chance," she whispered. 30 seconds later, the judge looked up, smiled, and said, "Good morning, Colonel." You could have heard a pin drop. My mother-in-law blinked twice, looked at me, then back at the judge. "You're a colonel," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I simply nodded. Then I turned my attention back to my daughter. Emily squeezed my hand so tightly her little fingers almost hurt. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. She looked up at me with nervous blue eyes. "Mom, are we gonna be okay?" I forced a smile. "We're going to tell the truth." That was all I promised, because truth was the only thing I knew for certain that morning. My name is Rebecca Harrison. I'm 46 years old, and until that moment, almost nobody in my husband's family knew what I'd spent over 2 decades doing before I became Emily's mother. They knew I'd served in the Army. They assumed I'd been an office worker, a supply clerk, maybe an administrator. I never corrected them, not because I was ashamed, because once I retired, I wanted to leave my rank at the gate and simply live as a wife and mother. Looking back now, maybe I hid that part of myself too well. That Wednesday morning in early October, Nashville Family Court was already crowded before 9 o'clock. Parents sat quietly on wooden benches. Children colored in activity books. Lawyers hurried down the hallway carrying thick folders and paper coffee cups. Everything smelled faintly of floor polish and stale coffee. Emily and I had arrived almost 40 minutes early. She wore the little navy dress she'd picked herself. "I look brave in blue," she'd told me over breakfast. I kissed the top of her head. "You absolutely do." Then they walked in. David. And his mother. Margaret Harrison always entered a room like she expected people to notice. Cream-colored pantsuit, pearl necklace, perfect hair. She spotted me immediately. "Oh," she said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. Rebecca actually showed up. David stood beside her wearing a charcoal suit I'd bought him years earlier for one of my retirement ceremonies. Funny how clothes outlive marriages. Margaret looked around the waiting area. No attorney. I didn't answer. She smiled. "I suppose they're expensive when you don't have much left." Emily moved a little closer to me. Margaret noticed. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said sweetly to my daughter. "You'll be living somewhere much nicer very soon." That sentence took every ounce of self-control I had. I wanted to tell her to stop talking to my child. I wanted to remind her that children weren't trophies to be won. Instead, I simply knelt beside Emily. "Remember what we talked about?" Emily nodded. "When grown-ups argue, I don't have to," she finished. "That's my girl." Margaret rolled her eyes, still giving little speeches. David finally spoke. "Mom, what?" "Not now." She shrugged dramatically. "I'm only being honest." Honest? That word almost made me laugh. If honesty had mattered to Margaret, we wouldn't have been standing outside courtroom 4B in the first place. At exactly 8:55, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "Custody docket, Harrison versus Harrison." Emily looked up at me again. I took a slow breath. "We're ready." At least, I hoped we were. Because 3 years earlier, if someone had told me I'd one day be fighting my own husband for custody of our daughter, I would have called them crazy. Back then, I thought David Harrison was the safest choice I'd ever made. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 years earlier, my life looked so ordinary that I honestly believed the hardest chapters were behind me. I had retired from the Army after 22 years. The retirement ceremony took place at Fort Campbell on a bright spring morning. There were speeches, handshakes, a folded flag, and far more photographs than I wanted. My parents drove down from Kentucky. My younger brother surprised me by bringing barbecue from my favorite place in Clarksville. When someone called me Colonel Harrison that day, it felt strangely distant. I remember telling one of my former officers, "Tomorrow I'm just Rebecca." At the time, I meant it. After 2 decades of deployments, command meetings, emergency logistics, and countless nights sleeping in temporary housing, I wanted something simple. A home, a family, a little girl who knew her mother would be there for every birthday. David seemed to want the same things. We met 6 months after my retirement at a fundraising dinner for wounded veterans in Franklin, Tennessee. I was helping organize silent auction items. He was there because his construction company had donated building materials for a housing project. He was charming without trying too hard. Funny. Patient. The kind of man who remembered to refill my coffee before I realized the cup was empty. On our 3rd date, he asked about my Army career. "What did you do?" "Logistics." He laughed. "That sounds important. It mostly means solving problems before everyone else notices they're happening." "I like that." I gave him the short version. I never talked about rank, never listed awards, never mentioned command. To me, that life was over. David never asked for more details. And honestly, I appreciated that. We married 18 months later in a small church outside Franklin. Nothing extravagant. About 60 guests, a reception at the community center with fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler. My old army friends teased me because I'd traded military precision for Southern comfort food. I told them comfort was exactly what I wanted. When Emily was born 2 years later, I thought I'd finally found the life I'd dreamed about during countless lonely nights overseas. Everything changed so gradually that I almost missed it. At first it was little comments. David would smile and say, "You don't have to organize everything like a military operation." He was joking. Mostly. Then Margaret started dropping by without calling. She'd open my refrigerator, rearrange kitchen cabinets, tell me Emily's bedtime was too early. One afternoon she watched me folding laundry and said, "You know the Army may have taught you discipline, but raising a family is completely different." I smiled politely. "I'm learning every day." She patted my shoulder. "I hope so." I tried to ignore it. People told me mother-in-law relationships could be complicated. I didn't want every disagreement to become a battle. David rarely defended me. Instead, he'd sigh and say, "Mom means well." That became his favorite sentence. If Margaret criticized my cooking, "Mom means well." If she questioned how I disciplined Emily, "Mom means well." If she suggested I was wasting David's money because I'd stopped consulting after Emily was born, "Mom means well." One evening after Margaret left, I finally asked him, "Do you ever notice how she talks to me?" He looked up from the television. "Rebecca, why do you always assume she's attacking you?" "I don't." "Then let it go." I wanted to. I truly did. Because every marriage has rough seasons. Every family has difficult personalities. I kept telling myself this was temporary. That if I stayed patient, things would improve. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't protecting my marriage. I was protecting the version of it I wished existed. And those are two very different things. The first real crack in our marriage didn't come from an argument. It came from our checking account. I was paying bills one Tuesday afternoon while Emily was at first grade. She loved school, especially Tuesdays, because they served grilled cheese and tomato soup in the cafeteria. I logged into our joint account with a cup of coffee beside me. The balance looked wrong. Not a few $100s wrong. Nearly $80,000 wrong. I refreshed the page. Then again. I checked the transaction history. Wire transfer. 2 weeks earlier. Another transfer. 3 days after that. A third one the following Monday. Together they accounted for almost everything we'd spent years saving. I stared at the screen, convinced there had to be some mistake. When David came home that evening, I met him in the kitchen. "Did the bank make an error?" He loosened his tie. "What error?" "The savings account." He froze for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. "I moved the money." I blinked. "You, what?" "I moved it." Without telling me, "It's still our money. It isn't in our account anymore." He walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and took out a bottle of water as calmly as if we were discussing the weather. "I've been restructuring things." I followed him. "David, that's $80,000. "I know exactly how much it is." "Then why didn't you tell me?" He twisted the cap off the bottle. "Because you'd overreact." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You emptied our savings." "I protected it." "From who?" He looked directly at me. "From uncertainty." That answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. 3 days later I found out. Emily had gymnastics on Thursday evenings. David said he'd pick her up afterward because I had a parent conference at school. When the meeting ended early, I decided to surprise them with ice cream. Instead, I drove into the parking lot of Margaret's house. David's truck was already there. So was Emily's little backpack. The front window was slightly open. As I walked toward the porch, I heard voices. "Margaret's?" "David's." "You've waited long enough," Margaret was saying. David sighed. "I know." "Then file the papers." "I'm going to." "And Emily," there was a pause. "We'll ask for primary custody." My heart started pounding. Margaret spoke again. "Rebecca has no chance if we do this correctly." David didn't answer. She continued. "She's been out of the workforce for years. She retired." "Exactly." Margaret almost sounded pleased. "The judge will see a mother with no current career and a stable father who can provide." I gripped the porch railing so hard my knuckles turned white. Then came the sentence that made my stomach drop. We'll also raise concerns about her military service. David's voice was quieter. Mom, people hear Army and think trauma. She doesn't have PTSD. That doesn't mean we can't ask questions. Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, David spoke. Our attorney said it could influence the custody evaluation. He knew. He knew it wasn't true. And he was willing to use it anyway. I backed away from the window before they could see me. I don't remember driving home. I only remember sitting in my driveway after dark while Emily slept in her car seat, still holding the stuffed rabbit she'd carried everywhere since preschool. That night, after putting her to bed, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because my marriage was ending. Because the man I loved was preparing to use our daughter as a weapon. The divorce papers arrived 6 days later. I wasn't surprised. But one page stopped me cold. Petition for sole physical custody. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, reading every accusation. Most of them weren't just unfair. They were completely false. For the first time since retiring from the Army, I realized this wasn't simply a divorce. It was a campaign. People always say divorce brings out the worst in people. I used to think that was just something folks said to make themselves feel better. Then I lived through one. Within 2 weeks of being served, our joint credit card was frozen. David had opened a new checking account in his own name months earlier. The utility bills that had always been paid automatically suddenly started bouncing back. I remember standing in line at the electric company in Franklin holding a folder full of paperwork, while wondering how two people who once promised to grow old together had ended up arguing over who should pay the water bill. Emily noticed everything. Children always do. One evening, she looked at me while I was making macaroni and cheese and asked, "Mom, are we poor now?" That question hurt more than the divorce papers. I smiled and stirred the pasta. "No, sweetheart." "Then why are you looking at prices every time we go to the grocery store?" Because I had started buying store brands. Because I'd stopped putting steak in the cart. Because every dollar suddenly mattered. But she didn't need to carry those worries. "We're just being smart with our money." She accepted that answer. Children often trust us long before we've earned it. The following Monday, I met with my second attorney. The first one had quoted nearly $30,000 just to prepare for trial. The second was kinder. He listened carefully, flipped through my paperwork, then leaned back in his chair. "Rebecca," he said gently, "you have a strong case." I felt hope for the first time in days. Then he slid a yellow legal pad across the desk. His estimated fees, almost $22,000. I thanked him for his honesty. Then I drove home and cried in a Kroger parking lot before buying milk and cereal. Over the next month, I sold almost everything that wasn't tied to a memory. The antique Ford pickup my father and I had restored together. A collection of crystal serving dishes I'd inherited from my grandmother. Several pieces of jewelry that had spent years sitting in a drawer. Each sale felt like another goodbye. One Saturday morning, Emily walked into the garage while I was watching a man drive away in Dad's old truck. "Are we selling Grandpa's truck?" I nodded. She slipped her hand into mine. "I liked that truck." "So did I." She leaned against me without saying another word. Sometimes a 7-year-old knows exactly when silence is kinder than questions. The emotional strain wasn't the only challenge. David's attorney filed motion after motion. Requests for financial records, medical records, military records, even my old counseling notes from years earlier after my retirement. It felt endless. One afternoon, I spread every document across my dining room table. Stacks of bank statements, tax returns, school records, military paperwork. Emily wandered in carrying a coloring book. "That's a lot of homework." I laughed for the first time all week. "It sure is." She climbed into my lap. "Are you gonna win?" I looked into her hopeful little face. Every instinct told me to promise everything would be okay. But the Army had taught me something important. Never promise what you can't control. So instead I kissed her forehead. "I'm going to fight as hard as I can." She smiled. "I know." That evening my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Colonel James Whitaker, my former brigade commander." We hadn't spoken in nearly 4 years. "Rebecca," he said warmly after I answered. "I heard what's happening. Word travels fast in military circles. I've got people who'd fly to Tennessee tomorrow if you needed them." I smiled despite myself. "I know you would." "So what's the plan?" I looked around my dining room at the mountain of paperwork. For a long moment I didn't answer. Then I finally said the only thing that felt right. "I'm going to beat them the same way we solved every impossible mission." "How's that?" "Preparation." There was a pause. Then he laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that. I didn't want favors. I didn't want anyone pulling strings. I wanted the truth to be enough. I just had to prove it. People sometimes assume that if you spend 22 years in the army, you come home wanting everyone to know about it. For me, it was the opposite. When I retired, I packed my uniforms into garment bags, folded away my medals, and stored every plaque and certificate in the attic. Not because I wasn't proud, because that chapter had ended. I wanted Emily to know me as the mom who packed her lunches and volunteered for field trips, not the officer who spent years solving supply crises halfway around the world. David knew I'd retired as an officer. He knew I'd spent most of my career in logistics. That was about it. He never asked what rank I'd held. Never asked what my job had actually involved. Neither did Margaret. She simply assumed that if I wasn't talking about my military career, it couldn't have been very important. I let her believe that. Looking back, maybe that was my mistake. Or maybe it wasn't. A week before the final custody hearing, Colonel Whitaker called again. "Have you changed your mind?" he asked. "About what?" "Accepting help. I appreciate it. But I don't want anyone making phone calls to judges or politicians." He laughed. "You know I'd never do that." "I know. We do have another idea." I leaned back in my kitchen chair. "I'm listening." "The court doesn't need favors." "No, it needs facts." That part I agreed with. 2 days later, a thick overnight envelope arrived from Fort Campbell. Inside were certified copies of my service record, performance evaluations, command assignments, letters of commendation, deployment history. Nothing classified. Nothing dramatic, just official records showing exactly who I had been for more than 2 decades. At the bottom of the stack sat one additional envelope, handwritten. "Rebecca, you won't need me in court, but if you need advice, call any time. Tom Richards, retired colonel, former JAG officer. We'd served together during a humanitarian operation after severe flooding along the Mississippi years earlier. He'd become an attorney after leaving active duty. When I called him that evening, he answered on the second ring. About time. You knew I'd call. I knew you'd at least read the note." For nearly 2 hours, he walked me through family court procedure. Not strategy. Procedure. When the other attorney objects, he said, "Don't panic." I won't. "If you don't understand a question, I'll ask for clarification." "Exactly." He paused. "Rebecca." "Yeah." "You're not walking into battle." I smiled. "I know. This isn't about defeating somebody. It's about protecting Emily. That's the mission." Mission. I hadn't used that word in years. Oddly enough, hearing it again settled my nerves. Over the next several evenings after Emily went to bed, I transformed our dining room into what looked like a command center. Yellow legal pads, sticky notes, 3-ring binders, colored tabs. I organized every document by date. Every bank statement, every email, every school record, every text message. If David's attorney asked a question, I wanted to know exactly where the answer lived. One night, Emily wandered downstairs wearing dinosaur pajamas and rubbing her eyes. "Mom, what are you doing up?" "I had a bad dream." She climbed into my lap. Her eyes drifted across the stacks of binders. "Is that for court?" "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something that broke my heart. "What if the judge doesn't believe you?" I looked at the little girl who trusted me with every part of her world. "I can't decide what someone else believes." She frowned. "So what can you do?" I smiled. "I can tell the truth." She thought about that. Then she nodded. "Truth's pretty strong." I kissed the top of her head. "It usually is." The night before the hearing, after Emily had fallen asleep, I stood in the attic looking at the garment bag that held my old army dress uniform. For a second, I considered taking it with me. Then I zipped the bag closed again. I wasn't going to court as a colonel. I was going as Emily's mother. The next morning at 8:55 sharp, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. I took my daughter's hand. And together, we walked inside. The courtroom felt smaller once everyone took their seats. Not physically, emotionally. Every cough seemed louder. Every page someone turned echoed through the room. Emily sat beside me, swinging her legs just enough that her shiny black shoes barely touched the floor. She clutched the stuffed rabbit she'd had since preschool. Across the aisle, David sat beside his attorney, Mark Ellison, a well-known family lawyer in Nashville. Margaret occupied the seat behind them, dressed as though she were attending a charity luncheon instead of a custody hearing. She caught my eye and smiled. Not kindly, confidently. She still believed this day belonged to them. The bailiff stood. "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Harold Simmons entered through the side door. He was probably in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His expression was calm, the kind that revealed nothing. He placed his folder on the bench, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the docket. Then he looked up. Our eyes met. His face softened. "Good morning, Colonel Harrison." For just a second, nobody moved. Then the room seemed to inhale all at once. Margaret frowned. David looked at me, then back at the judge. Even Mr. Ellison blinked in surprise. I smiled politely. "Good morning, Your Honor." The judge nodded once before returning to the file in front of him. That was it. No conversation. No special treatment. Simply professional recognition between two people whose paths had crossed years before. Behind me, I heard Margaret whisper, "You're a colonel." I turned slightly. "I retired several years ago." Her mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. She looked at David. "You didn't know—" David stared at me. "No." The realization spread across his face in slow motion. Not because rank automatically meant anything in family court. It didn't. But because he suddenly understood there was an entire part of my life he'd never cared enough to learn about. Judge Simmons cleared his throat. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Mr. Ellison stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Since I was representing myself, I rose as well. "Ready, Your Honor?" Margaret actually laughed under her breath. I ignored her. The judge reviewed a few preliminary matters before inviting Mr. Ellison to present David's case. For nearly 30 minutes, the attorney painted a picture of me that barely resembled reality. A retired military officer who struggled to adjust to civilian life. A mother who was rigid. Someone who allegedly lacked emotional flexibility. He spoke smoothly, confidently. When he finished, the judge turned toward me. "Mrs. Harrison." I stood. "I'd like to begin with Exhibit 4, Your Honor." Mr. Ellison handed over a folder. I smiled. "Your Honor, before addressing Exhibit 4, may I ask Mr. Harrison one question?" The judge nodded. "You may." David walked to the witness stand. He looked uncomfortable, not frightened, just uncertain. I walked to the podium carrying only a yellow legal pad. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. Just one question. "David, you testified that I withdrew from family life after retiring from the Army." "Yes," I nodded. "Who attended every parent-teacher conference Emily has ever had?" He hesitated. "You did." "Who coached her soccer team for 2 seasons?" "You." "Who volunteered in her classroom every Friday?" "You." I waited. "So when exactly did I withdraw from family life?" He looked toward his attorney. Mr. Ellison remained silent. David swallowed. "I meant emotionally." "I see." I opened a binder. "Would you like me to read the text message you sent me after one of those parent-teacher conferences?" He shifted in his seat. "No." I looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 12. Judge Simmons accepted the document and quietly began reading. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. The momentum inside the courtroom had changed. Not because of my military career, because facts have a way of cutting through assumptions. And this was only the beginning. Judge Simmons finished reading the text message before handing the document back to the clerk. "Exhibit 12 is admitted." Mr. Ellison stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The message doesn't establish the witness's overall parenting ability. It does establish the context of previous testimony," the judge replied calmly. "Objection overruled." I took a slow breath. One question at a time. That had always been my approach, whether I was coordinating supply convoys overseas or helping Emily with second-grade math. Trying to solve everything at once usually meant solving nothing. I looked at David again. "You testified that I struggled emotionally after leaving the Army." "Yes." "Can you tell the court when I was diagnosed with PTSD?" He frowned. "I don't know." "Did any doctor ever tell you I had PTSD?" "No." "Did you ever attend a medical appointment where that diagnosis was made?" "No." "Because it never happened?" He hesitated. "Correct." The courtroom became very still. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I simply wanted the facts on the record. Mr. Ellison redirected the questioning toward my retirement, suggesting that leaving a structured military career had made civilian life difficult for me. That part was true. I answered honestly. Retirement was an adjustment. "Were there days you felt lost?" "Yes." "Were there days you questioned your identity?" "Absolutely." He smiled slightly as though he'd scored an important point. "And during that period you were raising a young child?" "I was." "So wouldn't you agree that was emotionally challenging?" I nodded. "It was." He turned toward the judge. "No further questions." I understood what he was doing. He wanted the court to believe that admitting struggle meant admitting instability. When it was my turn again, I walked back to the podium. Your Honor, may I clarify something? You may. I faced the courtroom. Retiring after 22 years was difficult. I looked briefly at David. So was becoming a first-time mother. A few people smiled softly. I imagine retirement is hard for teachers, police officers, nurses, business owners, almost anyone who's spent decades building a career. Judge Simmons nodded slightly. The question isn't whether life changes us. I paused. It's whether we continue showing up for the people who depend on us. Then I picked up another binder. Your Honor, I'd like to discuss the marital savings account. Mr. Ellison shifted in his chair. I introduced certified bank statements showing 3 large transfers made by David without my knowledge. The dates were highlighted. The account numbers matched. Judge Simmons studied them carefully. I asked David one simple question. When did you first decide to move these funds? He glanced at his attorney. I don't remember. You don't remember transferring nearly $80,000. It was part of financial planning. I opened another folder. Then perhaps this email will refresh your memory. Mr. Ellison's head turned sharply toward me. I handed copies to the clerk. The email had been recovered during financial discovery. David had written it to his financial advisor nearly 4 months before filing for divorce. One sentence had been highlighted. I want everything separated before she realizes what's happening. David's face lost color. Margaret suddenly leaned forward. That's taken out of context. The judge looked over his glasses. Mrs. Harrison, you are not a party on the witness stand. She leaned back, visibly frustrated. I wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd also like to introduce phone records. Mr. Ellison stood again. On what basis? They establish repeated communication between Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Margaret Harrison immediately before and after each financial transfer. The judge accepted the documents. Margaret's confident smile disappeared. For the first time that morning she looked worried. Not because I'd revealed anything dramatic, because every document fit together like pieces of a puzzle. No accusations, no emotional speeches, just dates, times, records, and little by little the story they had carefully built was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. By early afternoon, the courtroom no longer felt like David's stage. It felt like a place where everyone was waiting to see what the evidence would say next. Judge Simmons called for a 15-minute recess. As people filed into the hallway, I stayed seated. I suddenly realized how exhausted I was. My shoulders ached. My mouth was dry. Representing yourself isn't glamorous. It means carrying every document, answering every question, and wondering every few minutes whether you've forgotten something important. Emily walked over from the children's waiting area with her coloring book tucked under one arm. Mom, yeah, sweetheart. She wrapped both arms around my waist. I think you're doing really good. I laughed softly. You've only heard about 5 minutes of grown-up talking. I know. She looked up at me. But Grandpa always says people tell the truth with how they act. I smiled. My dad's a smart man. He really is. That tiny conversation settled my nerves more than any legal advice ever could. Across the hallway, David stood talking quietly with Mr. Ellison. Margaret wasn't talking. She was pacing. Every few seconds she glanced toward me. Not with confidence anymore. With frustration. The bailiff called everyone back inside. Once the courtroom settled, Judge Simmons looked toward me. Mrs. Harrison, you may continue. Thank you, Your Honor. I stood and picked up one final binder. This portion concerns statements made in Mr. Harrison's custody petition. Mr. Ellison immediately rose. Your Honor, we've already addressed those allegations. I believe we addressed the conclusions, I replied calmly. I'd like to address how they were created. The judge nodded. Proceed. I walked to the witness stand. David, in your sworn filing, you stated that I frequently left Emily unattended because I was emotionally withdrawn. Yes. Can you tell the court the date that happened? He hesitated. I don't remember the exact date. Can you name one occasion? Silence. You also stated that Emily's teacher expressed concerns about my parenting. That's what I was told. By whom? He looked toward his attorney again. My mother. I nodded. No further questions. Then I turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a letter from Emily's classroom teacher. The clerk handed the letter to Judge Simmons. He read quietly for nearly a full minute. Finally, he looked up. The teacher's letter stated something simple but powerful. Rebecca Harrison has been one of the most consistently involved parents I've worked with in 23 years of teaching. Emily arrives prepared, feels safe, and clearly shares a loving relationship with her mother. At no time have I expressed concerns about Mrs. Harrison's parenting. Judge Simmons placed the letter on the bench. He turned toward David. Mr. Harrison. Yes, Your Honor. Did your daughter's teacher ever tell you Mrs. Harrison was an unfit parent? David swallowed. No. So that statement in your petition, it came from my mother. The courtroom became perfectly still. Judge Simmons shifted his attention. Mrs. Margaret Harrison. Margaret slowly stood. Yes, Your Honor. Did you tell your son that Emily's teacher questioned Mrs. Harrison's parenting? Margaret lifted her chin. I may have misunderstood a conversation. I quietly opened my final folder. Your Honor. The judge looked at me. I have one last exhibit. It was a voicemail. Margaret had accidentally left it on my phone months earlier. The clerk played it through the courtroom speaker. Her voice filled the room. David, if we're going to win custody, stop being nice. The judge doesn't know Rebecca. We just have to make her sound unstable long enough. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. When the recording ended, Judge Simmons removed his glasses. He looked first at Margaret, then at David. Finally, he said in a calm, measured voice, Mrs. Harrison, this court takes false allegations involving a child's welfare extremely seriously. Margaret opened her mouth to respond. The judge raised one hand. No, ma'am. She sat back down without another word. For the first time that day, she had nothing left to say. The courtroom stayed quiet for what felt like a full minute. Judge Simmons reviewed his notes one last time before folding his hands on the bench. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured. The kind of voice that carried more weight because it never needed to be loud. Custody decisions are not intended to reward one parent or punish another. He looked first at David, then at me. They exist for one purpose only. The best interests of the child. I glanced toward Emily. She sat beside the court-appointed child advocate, coloring another picture without any idea that the next few minutes would shape the rest of her childhood. Judge Simmons continued. During today's hearing, this court heard allegations concerning Mrs. Harrison's emotional stability. He paused. None of those allegations were supported by credible evidence. Mr. Ellison lowered his eyes to his legal pad. The judge turned another page. We also received documentary evidence showing that Mr. Harrison transferred substantial marital assets without his wife's knowledge while preparing for divorce. David stared at the floor. More concerning. The judge continued. The court heard and reviewed evidence suggesting an intentional effort to create a false narrative regarding Mrs. Harrison's ability to parent. No one said a word. Even Margaret remained perfectly still. Judge Simmons folded the file closed. Mrs. Harrison. Yes, Your Honor. I have reviewed school records, medical records, testimony, financial documents, and the recommendation of the court-appointed evaluator. He smiled gently. Every independent source describes you as a consistent, engaged, and loving parent. I felt my throat tighten. For months I'd questioned myself. Wondered if maybe I had somehow failed without realizing it. Hearing those words from someone who had examined every fact, it felt like I could finally breathe again. Judge Simmons continued. Therefore, the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. This court awards primary physical custody of Emily Harrison to her mother, Rebecca Harrison. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Not because I wanted to celebrate. Because I needed to steady myself. Emily looked up. Mom? I smiled through tears. We're going home together. She jumped out of her chair and wrapped both arms around me. I knew it. I laughed softly. I hoped so. Across the aisle, David slowly lowered his head into his hands. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat there. Judge Simmons wasn't finished. Mr. Harrison will receive parenting time according to the attached schedule. Then his expression became more serious. I strongly encourage both parents to remember that Emily deserves honesty, not conflict. He looked directly at David. And I suggest that future decisions regarding your daughter be made independently. Everyone understood what he meant. Margaret looked like she wanted to object. Instead, she quietly picked up her purse. For the first time since I'd known her, she walked out without saying a single word. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting for an unrelated criminal hearing scheduled later that afternoon. A few noticed our case ending and glanced over as families exited the building. Nobody stopped us. Nobody shoved microphones in our faces, which was exactly how I wanted it. As we reached the courthouse steps, David caught up with me. Rebecca. I turned. I owe you an apology. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. I should have trusted you. I looked at him for a long moment. You should have trusted the mother of your daughter. He nodded. I know. I won't keep Emily from you. His eyes lifted. But I won't let anyone teach her that lies are an acceptable way to win. I understand. For the first time in a very long while, I believed he actually did. Emily slipped her little hand into mine. Can we go get ice cream? I laughed. I think we've earned 2 scoops. As we walked toward the parking lot, she looked up at me with a grin. So, yes. Were you really a colonel? I smiled. I was. She squeezed my hand. I think that's pretty cool. Somehow, that meant more to me than every medal I'd ever received. A year has a funny way of changing what feels important. 12 months after the custody hearing, my life looked nothing like it had the day I walked into courtroom 4B. The house felt lighter, not because anything had changed physically. The same front porch, the same squeaky hallway floor, the same maple tree outside Emily's bedroom window. But the tension was gone. On weekday mornings, Emily and I had settled into a rhythm that finally felt like home. I woke before 6, started a pot of coffee, packed her lunch while she searched the house for whatever shoe or homework assignment had mysteriously disappeared overnight. Some mornings she danced into the kitchen singing whatever she'd learned in music class. Other mornings she shuffled in with messy hair and declared she was too tired for multiplication. Those ordinary moments became my favorite part of life. After everything we'd been through, ordinary felt like a gift. I also went back to work. Not in the army. That chapter had ended exactly when it should have. Instead, I accepted a part-time position mentoring military spouses who were preparing for civilian careers or facing difficult family transitions. Many of them carried the same fear I once had. Who am I if I'm not wearing the uniform anymore? I never gave speeches. I simply listened. Then I told them something I had learned the hard way. The uniform teaches you how to serve. It doesn't decide who you are after you hang it up. Those conversations helped me as much as they helped anyone else. David remained part of Emily's life. The court's parenting schedule worked better than I expected. To his credit, he never missed a weekend. He showed up to school concerts, soccer games, birthday parties. Slowly, he became the father Emily deserved. We were never close again, but we learned how to be respectful. That was enough. Margaret, on the other hand, faded quietly into the background. She saw Emily occasionally during David's parenting time, but she no longer tried to interfere. Whether the courtroom had changed her or simply made her realize there were consequences to crossing certain lines, I honestly don't know. And after a while, I stopped wondering. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and I were cleaning the attic when she found an old green garment bag tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. She dragged it across the floor. "Mom, what is it?" She unzipped it carefully. Inside hung my army dress uniform, the silver eagle insignia, the ribbons, the medals. She stared at it with wide eyes. "So this is what you wore?" "It is." She looked up at me. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I sat down beside her on the attic floor. "I didn't want you to think those things were the most important part of my life." "Aren't they?" I smiled. "No." "What is?" Without hesitation, I answered. "You." She leaned against my shoulder. "I still think you looked pretty cool." I laughed. "I did have a pretty sharp uniform." She giggled. "You should wear it for Halloween." "I think I'm a little old for that." "No way." For the next several minutes, we laughed until our stomachs hurt. It struck me then that this was the real victory. Not the courtroom. Not the judge recognizing my rank. Not proving Margaret wrong. The real victory was that Emily had grown up seeing strength without bitterness. She had watched her mother fight with facts instead of anger. She had learned that dignity lasts longer than revenge. Looking back, I realized the army taught me how to lead under pressure, but becoming Emily's mother taught me why that mattered. Rank opened doors in my career, but love carried me through the hardest battle of my life. If you've ever been underestimated or judged by only one chapter of your story, I hope you'll remember that people don't get to decide your worth, you do. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll join me again for another one. The end.